Madison Square Garden, June 5, 1999. 11.9 seconds remain in Game 3 of the Eastern Conference Finals. The New York Knicks trail Indiana by 3, 91-88, and the ball reaches Larry Johnson beyond the arc. Antonio Davis closes. Johnson takes one dribble, feels the contact, and hears a whistle before the shot is out of his hands. He keeps moving anyway. The ball rises over Davis, hangs above the Garden, and falls through. For an instant, nobody knows whether the basket will count. Then the referee extends 3 fingers toward the scorer's table. The building erupts. Indiana protests. One free throw still separates an improbable escape from an ordinary loss. And standing at the line is a player whose body has already taken away the game that once made him famous. 6 years earlier, Larry Johnson attacked the rim with enough force to look like the next stage in the evolution of the power forward. He was the first pick in the draft, Rookie of the Year, an All-NBA star, and the face of a Converse character called Grandmama. Charlotte had committed 12 years and $84 million to the belief that an early warning from his back could be managed and his rise would continue. The warning became the future. The lift faded. The rebounding declined. The young franchise built around him came apart. By the time Johnson reached New York, he was no longer being asked to carry an offense. He had become a lower-scoring veteran on a team that valued patience, strength, and survival. That is what makes the scene at the free throw line larger than one disputed call. The most remembered play of Johnson's NBA career did not belong to the physical phenomenon who was supposed to dominate the 1990s. It belonged to the player who remained after that future disappeared. Larry Johnson's career contains 2 basketball lives inside one body. The first made him a superstar before he was 24. The second forced him to surrender almost everything that had created that fame and find another way to matter. To understand how both versions arrived at the same line in Madison Square Garden, the story has to begin in Texas, with a prospect whose path to stardom was interrupted long before his back ever failed him. Larry Demetric Johnson was born on March 14, 1969, in Tyler, Texas, and grew up in Dallas. At Skyline High School, he developed the shape that would make him so unusual, roughly 6'7", built more like a football player, yet mobile enough to handle the ball and run the floor. Opponents his age were not prepared for that combination. If they used a smaller defender, Johnson took him inside. If they answered with size, he beat it with speed. Basketball also carried a meaning that statistics could not show. Years later, Johnson described himself as the only person from his neighborhood who had escaped the cycles of incarceration, addiction, street activity, and early death that consumed people he knew. Those memories stayed with him after the money and fame arrived. They shaped his sense of responsibility and eventually surfaced in public comments that became one of the most controversial episodes of his career. At Skyline, however, the future looked uncomplicated. Johnson shared Texas Mr. Basketball recognition, became a McDonald's All-American, and received National Player of the Year recognition from Basketball USA. Recruiters saw more than an advanced body. They saw a forward who could rebound like a traditional power player, move in transition, and make decisions with the ball. By the end of high school, he appeared ready to move directly into major college basketball. He verbally committed to Southern Methodist University and coached Dave Bliss, a logical destination for a Dallas star who could remain close to home. Then his qualifying SAT score was questioned and ultimately canceled by the Educational Testing Service. SMU was willing to admit him under conditions that would have required him to sit out a season. Johnson declined. Instead of waiting on a campus where his eligibility had become the story, he followed a different road west to Odessa College. Nobody doubted the basketball ability that had made Johnson a national recruit. The danger was visibility. Junior college offered smaller gyms, less national attention, and no guarantee that the route would lead back to the sport's largest stage. While other elite prospects appeared on major television broadcasts, Johnson had to protect his future in West Texas and trust that dominant play would carry his name beyond the level. He responded by making Odessa impossible to ignore. As a freshman in 1987 to 88, Johnson averaged 22.3 points per game. The following season, he pushed that figure beyond 29. The production was impressive, but the distinction attached to it was even rarer. He became the first player in NJCAA Division I history to win its National Player of the Year award in consecutive seasons, and he remains the only player to do it in both of his junior college years. Odessa became the first demonstration of a quality that would later save Johnson's professional career. The original plan had disappeared, but he did not spend his energy trying to recreate it. He accepted the level in front of him, dominated it, and made a new route valuable on its own terms. By the spring of 1989, he was not a forgotten recruit trying to return to Division I. He was one of the most coveted transfers in the country, with 2 seasons of eligibility and a body already capable of handling college basketball's most physical front courts. The recruiting battle ended with Jerry Tarkanian and the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. UNLV was not a quiet place to resume a career. The Runnin' Rebels played at speed, defended with pressure, and carried the swagger of a program that enjoyed making opponents uncomfortable. They were also followed by constant scrutiny surrounding Tarkanian and the NCAA. Every major game felt like basketball and theater occurring at the same time. Johnson fit both parts of that environment. His strength supplied the violence at the rim, but UNLV also revealed the subtler pieces of his game. He could catch on the move, pass before a double team arrived, and run the floor without needing the offense to slow down for him. Alongside future NBA players Stacey Augmon and Greg Anthony, plus tournament star Anderson Hunt, Johnson did not have to manufacture every shot. He could make an already talented lineup feel overwhelming. In his first season, the Rebels reached the 1990 National Championship game against Duke. The matchup was supposed to test whether UNLV's style would survive against a disciplined opponent on the largest stage. Instead, the final became a display of force. UNLV won 103-73, still the highest point total and largest victory margin in an NCAA men's championship game. Johnson contributed 22 points and 11 rebounds. The double-double mattered, but so did the manner of it. He did not need 30 shots or a carefully designed isolation on every possession. He ran, sealed smaller defenders, cleaned the glass, and converted the opportunities produced by the team's pressure. On a roster filled with professional talent, he remained the player whose physical presence changed the geometry of the floor. The victory placed a national title on a journey that had passed through a canceled test score and 2 junior college seasons. It also changed the burden awaiting UNLV. The Rebels would no longer enter the next year as hunters. They would be defending champions expected to win every night, and Johnson would begin the season as the most visible player on the most closely watched team in college basketball. UNLV answered with a perfect 27-0 regular season, winning by an average of more than 26 points. The numbers created an impression of invulnerability, yet they also removed nearly every ordinary measure of success. Winning was no longer enough. Close games looked like failure. Anything short of another championship would be treated as a collapse. The opponent waiting in the 1991 national semifinal was Duke, the team UNLV had beaten by 30 for the title 12 months earlier. This time, Duke controlled the final possessions and won 79-77. One of the most dominant defending champions in college history finished 34-1, with its only defeat ending the season 2 points short of another championship game. For Johnson, the loss introduced a lesson that would return throughout his professional life. A career can be excellent and still become defined by the future it failed to reach. That UNLV team was unquestionably great. Because it did not finish undefeated, people remember it through a question: how historic was it supposed to become? The defeat did not diminish Johnson's individual standing. In 1991, he won both the Wooden Award and the Naismith Award as the leading player in Division I basketball. Combined with his high school recognition and the consecutive NJCAA awards, The honors formed an almost unmatched progression across 3 levels of the American game. His efficiency made the resume even more striking. Johnson spent only 2 seasons at UNLV, yet left among the program's career leaders in scoring and rebounding while converting his shots at a rate normally associated with centers who rarely operated away from the rim. He was not merely bigger than college defenders. He understood where his advantages were and reached those areas before the defense could organize. NBA scouts carried the same puzzle into the professional evaluation process. Johnson was not a conventional 6'10" power forward, and he was not merely a wing who happened to be strong. He was a compact front court creator, powerful enough to control the paint, quick enough to lead a break, and skilled enough to attack from multiple spots. His height raised questions about defending taller NBA players. His strength and mobility created a more urgent question for opponents. Who were they supposed to use against him? Charlotte held the first selection in the 1991 NBA draft. The Hornets had existed for only 3 seasons, wore uniforms unlike anything else in the league, and drew enormous crowds without yet possessing the history of an established franchise. Johnson offered them the one thing an expansion team cannot manufacture through presentation: a young star around whom an actual basketball identity could be built. They selected him first overall, and he supplied immediate evidence that the choice was sound. As a rookie, Johnson averaged 19.2 points and 11 rebounds while appearing in all 82 games. He won Rookie of the Year and logged more minutes than any other first-year player. The following season, he would lead the entire NBA in both total minutes and minutes per game. The schedule that often exposes a young player's weaknesses instead made durability look like part of his foundation, at least as everyone understood it then. Charlotte's popularity was already extraordinary for a new team. The Hornets led the NBA in attendance during their inaugural season and would lead it 7 consecutive times from 1990 to 97, part of a run of 364 straight home sellouts. The old Charlotte Coliseum held roughly 24,000 people, so those numbers were not being produced by a small boutique arena. The city filled one of the largest buildings in the league before the roster had earned a winning season. Johnson gave that enthusiasm a face. The colors and Hugo the Hornet could attract attention, but a franchise becomes credible when opponents have to plan for one of its players. Every double-double made the expansion project feel less temporary. He was not responsible for creating Charlotte's appetite for the NBA. He was the first player capable of matching its scale. His game also looked unusually modern. Johnson was shorter than many power forwards, but he turned the low center of gravity into leverage. He could rebound, push the ball himself, and force a defense to decide whether to stop the break or locate shooters. In the half court, he punished smaller assignments near the basket and attacked slower ones from the face-up. The phrase positionless basketball had not entered everyday NBA language, yet Johnson was already demonstrating why fixed positional labels could become inadequate. Charlotte added Alonzo Mourning with the second pick in 1992. Mourning brought rim protection, intensity, and another personality accustomed to being central. Around them were Muggsy Bogues, whose speed and vision animated the offense, and Del Curry, one of the league's most dangerous reserve shooters. The contrasts made the Hornets instantly recognizable. The shortest player in the NBA, feeding 2 powerful young big men, while Teal flooded the arena. In the 1992-93 season, Johnson produced the best numbers of his professional career: 22.1 points, 10.5 rebounds, and better than 4 assists per game, all while playing every night. He was voted into the All-Star starting lineup, the first Hornet ever given that distinction, and earned second-team All-NBA honors. More importantly, Charlotte reached the playoffs for the first time. The Hornets eliminated Boston in the opening round on Mourning's series-winning jumper, then met New York and the harsher realities of postseason basketball. They lost in 5 games, but the season changed the scale of the project. Charlotte was no longer selling only potential. With Johnson 24 and Mourning 23, it seemed to have the front court around which an Eastern contender could be built for years. That Boston victory also made Charlotte the first of the NBA's 4 late 80s expansion franchises to win a playoff series. Only 5 years after the organization had no roster, it had eliminated the Celtics and moved into a second round against Madison Square Garden. The speed of the ascent encouraged a dangerous assumption. Because Johnson and Mourning had arrived so quickly, contention would continue developing in a straight line. Johnson's visibility expanded even faster than the team's record. Converse transformed him into Grandmama, an elderly woman in a floral dress, wig, and glasses who entered a gym and played with Johnson's power. The joke depended on contrast. The costume promised fragility, then the character attacked the rim. Johnson committed to the performance instead of treating it as an embarrassment, and the campaign crossed well beyond basketball audiences. Grandmama appeared on the television comedy Family Matters. Johnson became a recognizable figure to families who could not have named Charlotte's place in the standings. In 1994, his image would also lead the first issue of Slam, a magazine built around the emerging idea that basketball, fashion, music, and personality belonged to the same culture. The campaign worked because Johnson allowed himself to be the joke without surrendering the power underneath it. Most star advertising protects an athlete's coolness at every moment. Grandmama placed a #1 pick in a wig and dress, then let the performance become cooler than the people laughing at the costume. Children could imitate the character, adults could remember the commercial, and basketball fans still received the violence of the finish at the rim. The campaign gave Johnson something most young stars never receive: a public identity independent of any single game. It also froze a particular version of him in the popular imagination. Grandmama was explosive, playful, and physically unstoppable. The advertisements could be replayed forever. The body performing those dunks could not. The first warning arrived before the record contract. During a charity game in July of 1993, Johnson reached the ball behind his head for a tomahawk dunk. He felt something pull in his lower back. Doctors found a herniated disc, and Charlotte announced that its All-NBA forward would need 4 to 6 weeks of rehabilitation. The timing made the injury easy to treat as a summer interruption. Johnson had just played all 82 games for a second straight year and led the league in minutes. There was no long history of missed games suggesting that his body had become unreliable. A rehabilitation timetable offered the organization a comforting interpretation. The disc was a problem to manage before training camp, not the beginning of a different career. On October 5th, Charlotte acted on that belief. Johnson signed a 12-year extension reported at $84 million, then the largest contract in professional sports. The Hornets knew about the summer injury and still projected him through the remainder of the decade and deep into the next one. The deal was not made in ignorance. It was a massive bet that youth, rehabilitation, and Johnson's previous durability would keep the warning from becoming a pattern. The pattern appeared before the calendar changed. On December 27th, against the Detroit Pistons, Johnson suffered another back sprain. This time, he disappeared from the lineup for more than 2 months. Charlotte went 9-22 during his absence, falling out of the playoff race while the player attached to its historic contract tried to recover his conditioning and timing. Johnson missed 31 games after missing none in his first 2 seasons. He later acknowledged that maintaining the injury required more discipline than he initially gave it. Looking back, he said, "If I'd done everything I should have the first couple of years, I'd have had a better career." The admission adds responsibility without turning a damaged disc into a moral failure. He was 24, accustomed to a body that had always answered, and learning too late that rehabilitation had become part of the job, rather than a temporary pause from it. Back problems are especially destructive for a player whose advantages begin with force. Johnson generated offense by lowering his body, absorbing contact and exploding through defenders who were often taller. The back connected all of it: balance, leverage, rotation, lift, and the confidence to collide without protecting the next movement. He could return to the floor without recovering the exact physical freedom that made the original game possible. His averages fell to 16.4 points and 8.8 rebounds during the shortened season. Those were useful numbers, but they did not continue the same trajectory as 22 and 10 at age 23. The frightening part was not immediate ineffectiveness. It was watching his margin over ordinary defenders narrow at the age when experience should have been making every physical advantage more dangerous. The Grandmama image made the change stranger. Commercials and television appearances kept presenting the airborne, overpowering character, while the real Johnson learned which movements his back would still permit. His crossover presence would continue into the films Eddie and Space Jam in 1996. The public could encounter Johnson more often than ever while seeing less of the player who had created that attention. He did not respond by trying to reproduce every lost dunk. He moved portions of his offense away from the rim. During his first 3 NBA seasons, Johnson had made 28 three-pointers. In 1994-95, he made 81 and shot 38.6% from beyond the arc. The NBA had shortened the three-point line that season, an important piece of context, but the tactical change remained clear. Johnson was taking and converting a shot that had previously been peripheral to his identity. The new range altered the decisions facing his defender. A slower power forward could no longer wait near the paint without conceding a jumper. If that defender followed Johnson outside, the lane opened for Mourning, Bogues, or a Johnson drive that required less vertical force than battling through a crowded post lane. The shot was not only a way to replace lost points, it reorganized space so that the remaining parts of his game had room to function. There was a cost hidden inside the same season. Johnson's rebounding fell from 10.5 per game before the injury to 7.2. Some of that change came from positioning farther from the basket and sharing the interior with Mourning. Some reflected the missing lift and repeated contact. The box score was already recording both sides of the reinvention, new production arriving from distance while an old source of control receded. The adjustment extended beyond the jumper. He learned to create from the elbows, use strength without depending on elevation, and recognize passes produced by defensive attention. In some possessions, he resembled a large wing. In others, a compact post facilitator. The scoring explosions became less frequent, but the floor did not shrink around him as quickly as his back might have forced it to. Johnson returned to the All-Star game in 1995. During the previous summer, he had also won gold with the United States at the 1994 World Championship as part of the team known as Dream Team 2. Those achievements can make the injury appear less decisive than it was. They show that Johnson remained an excellent player, not that the original physical ceiling had returned. The clearest evidence came in his final Charlotte season. In 1995-96, Johnson played 81 games and averaged 20.5 points, 8.4 rebounds, and 4.4 assists. He was productive enough to resemble the old star in a box score. Watch the manner of the production, however, and the transformation is visible. More possessions ended in jumpers or deliberate post moves. Fewer began with an athletic advantage that no scheme could solve. Years later, Johnson was asked which modern player reminded him of his younger self. He chose Amare Stoudemire and focused on one quality: the way Stoudemire attacked the rim. "That's how I used to play before my back injury," Johnson said. The answer contained no complaint and no statistical argument. He remembered the old game as a direction, through defenders and toward the basket, that his body no longer allowed him to choose as often. The injury did not turn him into a bench player overnight. Johnson could still carry large minutes and major offensive responsibility. What narrowed was the path toward becoming one of the defining front court players of the decade. Experience kept adding solutions, but the physical advantages required to apply them were no longer growing beside it. Johnson had already rebuilt enough of his game to remain valuable. Charlotte, meanwhile, was confronting a different problem. The partnership between its two young stars had become strained, and the organization faced contract decisions that talent alone could not resolve. The Johnson-Mourning partnership had always contained an obvious tension. Johnson arrived first, owned the record contract, and represented the franchise in popular culture. Mourning was younger, intensely competitive, and essential to Charlotte's defense. Both had reasonable claims to the future of the team. Neither was naturally suited to behaving like the other man's supporting piece. Personal friction became part of the public explanation, but the breakup was not merely a contest between two egos. Charlotte was also deciding how much money to commit to a front court that had not yet carried the team beyond the second round. In 1994-95, the Hornets won 50 games, then lost to Chicago in the opening round. The talent was obvious, the championship path was not. Before the following season, contract negotiations with Mourning failed, and Charlotte traded him to Miami for a package led by Glenn Rice and Matt Geiger. The move removed one side of the rivalry, but did not restore the original plan. Johnson played heavy minutes and produced another 20-point season, yet the Hornets missed the playoffs. The roster around him had changed, and the organization no longer appeared willing to treat the 12-year contract as a reason to preserve the partnership indefinitely. In July of 1996, Charlotte traded Johnson to the New York Knicks for Anthony Mason and Brad Lohaus. 3 years after making the largest financial commitment in professional sports, the Hornets sent its intended franchise cornerstone away. Within the span of 2 off-seasons, both young stars from the celebrated Johnson-Mourning Foundation were gone. The trade was not an admission that Johnson could no longer play. New York was acquiring a 27-year-old coming off averages of 20.5 points, 8.4 rebounds, and 4.4 assists. But the Knicks were not asking him to recreate Charlotte. Patrick Ewing already owned the center of the offense, and the team's ambitions were immediate. Johnson would have to translate his strengths into fewer shots, a slower pace, and a hierarchy in which his name no longer appeared first. Johnson's first New York season made the new hierarchy unmistakable. His scoring fell from 20.5 points per game to 12.8, the lowest full-season average of his career at the time. Some of that decline reflected his back, but opportunity mattered as well. Patrick Ewing occupied the interior, Allen Houston needed touches on the perimeter, and Jeff Van Gundy preferred a controlled offense that valued each possession over tempo. The lineup demanded another adjustment. With Ewing at center and Charles Oakley at power forward, Johnson often operated as a small forward. Charlotte had once used his mobility to create an advantage against larger fours. New York placed him beside 2 traditional interior players and asked him to function farther from the basket against quicker wings. The alignment could compress spacing, but it also produced one of the league's strongest front courts and allowed the Knicks to punish smaller teams on the glass and in the post. St. Johnson therefore had to make decisions earlier. Holding the ball while searching for a spectacular move would allow the defense to crowd Ewing. A quick entry pass, reversal, or screen could keep the possession alive even if it produced no statistic for Johnson. The change from franchise centerpiece to connective player was not simply a matter of shooting less. It required him to judge success through what happened after the ball left his hands. For Johnson, accepting a smaller statistical role did not mean becoming irrelevant. He could space away from Ewing, make an extra pass, defend physically, and use his broad frame against front court players who towered over him. The same body that no longer produced effortless elevation could still establish position. New York turned limitations that had reduced his stardom into tools for a supporting role. The fit also had an emotional logic. Charlotte had sold youth, color, and possibility. The late 90s Knicks built their identity around defense, patience, and confrontation. Their playoff games slowed into half-court arguments in which every cut required contact and every rebound carried consequence. Johnson no longer had to look like Grandmama. He had to hold his ground and make the correct play when space disappeared. That culture sometimes crossed the line. In the 1997 Eastern Conference semifinals, New York led Miami 3-1 before an altercation involving Charlie Ward and P.J. Brown changed the series. Knicks players left the bench area, triggering automatic suspensions that were staggered across the final 2 games. Johnson served his suspension in Game 7. Without him and other penalized teammates, New York lost the game and the series. The ending was painful because it was partly self-inflicted. A team built on emotional intensity had allowed that same intensity to remove essential players from the floor. For Johnson, it also tied his New York identity to something other than his former scoring numbers. He was now part of the collective personality of the Knicks, including the consequences that accompanied it. 1 year later, the rivalry with Miami produced an even more personal image. Late in Game 4 of the first round, Johnson and Alonzo Mourning confronted each other and exchanged punches. Jeff Van Gundy entered the crowd of bodies and ended up clinging to Mourning's leg as players and coaches tried to separate them. The scene looked absurd, but the history underneath it was serious. The 2 cornerstones Charlotte once imagined growing together were now opponents in an elimination series. Johnson and Mourning were suspended for Game 5. New York won without Johnson, Miami lost without Mourning. The 7th-seeded Knicks eliminated the 2nd-seeded Heat, but the victory did not make the confrontation wise or necessary. It demonstrated how fully Johnson had entered the emotional world of his new team. The rivalry that began as a question of ownership in Charlotte had followed both men into a postseason battle between New York and Miami. By 1999, Johnson's role was settled. The lockout-shortened Knicks added Latrell Sprewell and Marcus Camby, giving the offense more speed and another primary scorer. Ewing remained the franchise center, Houston the polished shotmaker, and Johnson the veteran connector in the front court. No part of that description resembled the future imagined when Charlotte signed him for 12 years. Yet the reduced role placed him in position for the largest moment of his professional life. New York entered the playoffs as the 8th seed, survived Miami on Allen Houston's series-winning shot, and swept Atlanta. In the Eastern Conference Finals against Indiana, Ewing suffered a partial tear of his Achilles tendon in Game 2 and was ruled out with the series tied at 1 victory apiece. Game 3 would be New York's first attempt to continue without the player around whom the franchise had been organized for 14 seasons. Every remaining veteran was being asked to provide something the roster had not planned to lose. The play that gave New York that 2-1 lead began with 11.9 seconds remaining in Game 3. Johnson later remembered that the timeout did not end with his name as the first option. The play was designed for Allen Houston. Before the players returned to the floor, Marcus Camby grabbed him and delivered a prediction. "You getting this ball." Johnson did not wait passively for that prediction to come true. He worked through 2 screens until the possession circled back to him. Indiana had spent the possession trying to prevent exactly what New York needed, a clean 3-point attempt. Johnson received the ball high on the left side with Antonio Davis close enough to contest. Rather than rise immediately, he put the ball on the floor and moved toward Davis. The decision was calculated. Johnson needed either separation for the shot or contact that might persuade the referee to stop the clock. Davis reached as Johnson gathered. The whistle sounded, and Johnson continued into a 3-pointer that fell through the basket with 5.7 seconds remaining. Referee Jess Kersey ruled that Johnson had begun his shooting motion, so the basket counted and the foul produced 1 additional free throw. Indiana's objection was immediate and understandable. The whistle appeared to precede the release, and continuation rules gave the official considerable judgment over when the act of shooting began. Without the modern replay process available for such a sequence, the ruling on the floor controlled the game. Pacers supporters would remember it as a call that should have produced a side-out foul, not 4 possible points. Johnson still had to complete the play. The Garden had moved from anxiety to chaos, but the score remained tied until the free throw. He stepped to the line, took the ball, and converted. New York led 92-91. Indiana's final possession failed, and the Knicks left the floor with a 2-1 series advantage. The call remains part of the memory because controversy and execution cannot be separated. Remove Kersey's continuation ruling and the famous sequence does not exist. Remove Johnson's balance, concentration, and newly developed perimeter game, and there is no shot for the ruling to preserve. The moment required both a decision Indiana believed was wrong and a piece of skill Johnson had spent years adding after his back injury. Young Larry Johnson did not need a three-pointer to explain his value. He could decide games through rebounding, transition power, and pressure at the rim. The veteran in New York lived farther from the basket and understood how to manufacture an advantage from timing and contact. The shot looked nothing like a Grandmama dunk. It belonged entirely to the game he had built afterward. New York still needed 3 more victories to reach the NBA Finals, and the 4-point play did not win the conference by itself. It gave the Knicks control of Game 3 and a lead in the series. They eventually defeated Indiana in 6. By then, Ewing was unavailable, Johnson was carrying more responsibility on an injured team, and an 8th seed had become the first in NBA history to reach the finals. The series-clinching 6th game added another injury. Johnson sprained his left knee and entered the finals with his availability under scrutiny. New York had reached the championship round without Ewing, and now Johnson moved from the celebration into treatment for a fresh problem layered on top of the chronic one. Even the greatest run of his professional career came with another reminder that his body would never stop participating in the outcome. The moment should have allowed Johnson's second act to end in uncomplicated celebration. Instead, comments he made during the championship series moved attention from his reinvention to a much larger and more difficult argument. During the finals against San Antonio, Johnson referred to the Knicks as rebellious slaves. He was describing a group of predominantly black players working inside a league controlled largely by white executives and owners. The comparison was intentionally provocative, and the historical weight of the language made the reaction immediate. Commentators questioned both the analogy and the judgment required to introduce it during the championship series. NBC analyst Bill Walton attacked Johnson personally and described the situation as a disgrace. Johnson did not retreat from the argument. When asked to explain, he returned to the Dallas neighborhood he had left behind. Professional basketball had given a small number of visible black athletes wealth and opportunity, but he did not believe their success accurately described the conditions awaiting many people at home. Money had changed his individual life without erasing what he remembered or what he continued to see when he went back. The explanation did not settle whether the comparison was appropriate. Some listeners heard an athlete using his platform to discuss race and power. Others heard a millionaire comparing professional employment to one of history's greatest crimes. Johnson knew the phrase would provoke, and the response showed that its historical weight could not be controlled once it entered the public conversation. The episode reveals a part of Johnson that Grandmama never could. The commercial character made him accessible, funny, and uncomplicated. The man behind it carried memories and convictions that did not fit comfortably inside a marketing campaign. During the most visible week of his Knicks career, those two public identities collided. New York lost the finals to San Antonio in 5 games. Johnson did not receive the championship ending that might have placed a cleaner frame around the 4-point play. He returned for 2 more seasons, but the back problem that had altered his game in Charlotte was approaching its final decision. Johnson returned the following season and helped New York reach the Eastern Conference Finals again. The opponent was Indiana, giving the Pacers an opportunity to answer the series permanently associated with the 4-point play. Johnson averaged 13 points in the 6 conference finals games and scored 25 in Game 2, evidence that the veteran version could still occupy a larger role when a series demanded it. Indiana won the rematch in 6 and advanced to the finals. By then, the decline was becoming harder to manage between important nights. Johnson averaged 10.7 points during the 1999-2000 regular season and 9.9 in his final year. He could still use strength and experience, but recovery became part of every performance. The skill set had survived the first transformation. The back was now reducing the time and consistency with which he could access it. In the autumn of 2001, Johnson reportedly failed his team physical. On October 10th, the Knicks and Johnson finalized a buyout, ending his NBA career because of chronic back problems. He was 32 years old. The 12-year agreement Charlotte had once expected to cover his prime still had years remaining on its original timeline. His final record does not resemble a failed first pick. Across 10 seasons and 707 games, Johnson averaged 16.2 points, 7.5 rebounds, and more than 3 assists. He made 2 All-Star teams, earned second-team All-NBA honors, won Rookie of the Year, reached the finals, and started every postseason game he played. The career was substantial. The unresolved feeling comes from how much of it occurred after the central physical advantage had already been reduced. Counterfactual careers are easy to exaggerate. No one can know whether a healthy Johnson would have become a perennial All-NBA selection, whether Charlotte would have kept mourning, or whether the young Hornets could have passed the strongest teams in the East. His peak season did not guarantee a Hall of Fame future. It did establish a credible question. At 23, Johnson averaged 22 points, 10 rebounds, and 4 assists while playing all 82 games for a playoff team. That is not imagined potential. It is an elite season that happened before the normal prime of most NBA stars. The style makes the question even more compelling. Johnson's combination of strength, transition handling, passing, and face-up scoring anticipated the direction front-court basketball would take. In a later era, a team might have surrounded him with shooting, used him as a small ball center, and encouraged even more creation from the perimeter. In his own era, he was already forcing defenses to choose between size and mobility. A healthy back would not have removed every weakness, but it might have allowed that versatility to keep growing instead of becoming a method of compensation. During his first 2 seasons, Johnson played 164 of 164 possible regular season games and averaged more than 40 minutes a night. Durability looked so firmly attached to his profile that an injury was easy to interpret as an interruption. After the back problems became chronic, he never again reached his second season averages in both scoring and rebounding. He learned to reproduce portions of the old production, but not the same physical command. Walking away required another kind of restraint. "I got totally away from ball when I retired," Johnson later explained. Staying close made him want to return his back would not permit, so distance became part of accepting the decision. In 2007, he completed a Bachelor of Arts degree in Social Science Studies at UNLV. The achievement closed a circle that had begun with uncertainty over a standardized test and a route through junior college. The original schedule had changed. The value of finishing had not. Other parts of his life returned without asking him to play. The discipline of his Islamic faith, including observing Ramadan during NBA seasons, had always existed beyond the Grandmama costume. UNLV's place in his history was recognized by the Southern Nevada Sports Hall of Fame in 2008, followed by the Texas Sports Hall of Fame in 2014. Between those honors, the Knicks hired Johnson as a basketball and business operations representative in 2012. Madison Square Garden gave him a route back into the sport that did not require another negotiation with his spine. Charlotte preserved a different part of him. Johnson was the first #1 pick and first All-Star starter of the original Hornets era, the figure who helped turn a young team into a national object of fascination. The teal uniform, #2, and Grandmama became a single memory even for viewers who cannot recall his averages. The character lasted because it captured the contradictions in his game: size with quickness, intimidation with humor, an old costume containing young force. But that perfect cultural image can hide the years between the dunks and New York. His back forced the change while his salary, celebrity, and public identity still belonged to the player in the commercials. Return, then, to the free throw line in June of 1999. Johnson has already made the disputed three. The Garden is shaking, Indiana is furious, and one shot remains. The younger player had built his fame by overwhelming uncertainty with physical force. The veteran cannot rise above the moment in the same way. He has to stand still inside it. He makes the free throw. That single point does not restore the career Charlotte purchased in 1993. It does not answer how good a healthy Larry Johnson might have become, erase the conflicts with mourning, or turn the Knicks into champions. It gives the second career something the first one was expected to produce, a moment that survives every argument around it. Larry Johnson entered the NBA looking like the future of his position. The future changed before he could reach it. What followed was not a clean tragedy and not a complete comeback. It was a decade-long negotiation between memory and limitation. One player learning how to release an identity while millions of people still recognized him by it. Grandmama promised domination. The back removed that possibility. The man who remained found range, accepted a different place in the hierarchy, and reached the defining possession anyway. His greatest moment arrived after his physical prime was gone, and only the player he became could have created it.